Mr. Barun Mitra. He's the founder and director of the Liberty Institute, a non-profit independent public policy research organization in India. He specializes in the development of the environment, specifically how property rights in land can empower local farmers in rural areas and encourage prosperity. So let's welcome Mr. Barun Mitra. Finish your card to show you there's 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, it's quicker. The right is slow.
I don't know, what can I say after Lee's talk, because I'm still I've heard this before and I'm still kind of trying to recover my thoughts to be able to continue on that. But what I'll try to do perhaps is, and we heard my friend Jack Ma a little earlier, Ma Junjing, and I think one thing that I can try to do is try to paint, I didn't want to do it, I thought I'll paint a bleaker picture, but I don't think I can paint a bleaker picture after the last 2 talks, so I'll try to turn my picture into a more brighter one. And perhaps a few pointers for the future in a good way, hopefully. So the question is, and we discussed it earlier today, and I'm particularly glad that Razin Saleh, another old friend, is here, because I think it ties up with quite a few, and Professor Holcomb yesterday and today, ties up with quite a few things that we heard right through the last 2 days. That's about the rule of law and property as institutions. And the one that we were supposed to discuss in this session is the issue of developing countries and therefore the poverty. The question is, we have discussed poverty for perhaps 100 years. I mean, really studied. The poverty has been studied, Nobel Prizes have been won, but poverty seems to have persisted quite steadily for a long time and continues today in many parts, including my own country. So I thought, rather than looking at how deep and how big the problem of poverty is, I'd just say that it's a miracle that the poverty has continued, because miracle is something that we cannot explain. So let's try and look at some things that we can explain. So firstly, with a bit of a definition, that is, poverty, as I say it, is not that we don't have cash in our pockets or in our bank accounts. It's our inability to capitalize whatever we have, including our own properties that we might own, my cell phone or the house, or the labor that I can, and Ken was very willing to sell his labor pretty freely today in the afternoon. So what we need to think of is that poverty is not something that is given. It's a consequence of some things that we ourselves have created. And like Lee said, it was quite man-made. People have struggled. And in fact, if you look at the poor, they seem to spend much of their waking hours trying to survive. So it's not that they're lazy and unable to do work, but they continue to be trapped in poverty. So to me, it is this inability to capitalize that's the challenge. And I won't get through this because I think people have already spoken on the issues of poverty and property and the rule of law and justice as an institutional mechanism. So let me just jump because we are already running into time. The issue that I want to really focus on, and which has been quite close to my heart for a long time, but particularly in the last 5-7 years, because I got to see it not from books and academic discussions, but from watching my friends working in parts of really remote rural India and trying to see what can be done about it. One issue, we know China started reforms in 1978. India started reforms, at least that's the cutoff date that generally referred to, is 1991. What I'm going to talk about is one area where nothing much has changed. And that might partly explain the challenge of poverty and also the potential for change in future. A third of India is today quite like China. Quite a lot of China faces the same problem. Is witnessing protests on land. That is land that people are using or people claim they own it, but somebody else, including the state, thinks that they don't own it. So there's a conflict over land, and this takes over, has taken over, and emerged as the topmost political agenda in India today. The governments and the political establishment finds it very difficult, unlike 20, 30, 40 years ago, to face this issue, because displacing people has become increasingly difficult, no matter how heavy the hand of the state might be. Why is it coming so small? Yeah, compatibility issues, I think. It didn't show so small on my screen. Yeah, and we have the result of that conflict, the conflict over land, is we have a paradox. Almost half the Indian farmers want to quit farming, as most of you in this room no longer have families in farming. And another half of India wants land for various uses, including businesses and industries, but they can't transact. Normally, you have if there's a surplus and if there's a scarcity, either the price mechanism would come in or there would be more supply coming in to balance it out, like you said, Kyle, in terms of medicine, that if the prices go up, or in terms of kidneys, the prices go up, more supply come in. But here the supply can't come in because the conflict has held the supply back. So we have a conflict, and this is illustrated in terms of the most startling figure, and which is why the government began to notice it over the last 10 years, is about $100 billion of investments are stuck, partly because of the conflict over land. That is, investments that have either been made or investment that has been promised, but they cannot find the land on which to get them. So I'm already into 5 minutes. So there was a new law that came up after 8-10 years of protest by many people from the left and the right of the political spectrum, which sought to recognize the rights of some of the poorest indigenous tribes in India, which is about 100 million people. You know, India is not too large a country, but 100 million people are in that category, which are indigenous tribes whose land rights were completely ignored over the last 150 years. So this law was to recognize those lands. And I can show you, the government has tried to do something. They have issued titles, but there's a problem, as with in many areas in governance in our kind of countries, that the government's efficiency is rather poor. So they have issued these titles which are very faulty. For instance, in this case, this lady, who's a widow, has received a title, but the title for the land which she has received is quite different from the land which she is farming. This guy received a title with a red dot, as you can see. So except that guy, no one would know where that land is, which means that land cannot really be transacted at all. And this is leading to a problem of implementation of this law. And as Rainer Heufers was saying, there is kind of a technological solution, but it's not very easy to get through. This is some of my friends. This is the kind of meeting that I have been associated with over the last 5-7 years because of my friends working in these villages. This is the kind of maps that people traditionally drew on hand, because that's the only thing that was possible. And this kind of meetings where they agreed or disagreed on what was being claimed. A particular transformation that happened a few years ago, 2010-11, was two technologies that we came across. We don't come with, although I'm an engineer of a vintage. I graduated 35 years ago, so my engineering skills today are of no use. The two technologies that came in that's before the smartphone. Now all of you have this technology, which is the handheld GPS instruments because of the satellites. The global positioning system. The GPS that can give you the coordinates. And then what we found, again quite accidentally, was that Google was making satellite images available on their Google Earth, or Google Map, which most of you use today. But Google Earth, if any of you have used it, any of you use Google Earth? Yeah. Google Earth has a unique advantage. It can show you images of the past, archival images. And this law is particularly useful for because it gives a cutoff date of December 2005. So our attempt had been, through Google and through other agencies, to find maps of 2005 so that we can map the areas. And the areas that are being farmed are being mapped by people themselves, like this lady. They go around their fields to map their land because they are the only ones who seem to know where they are farming. And on the map, because they're old maps, these images are old, we can actually see whether the farming was happening in 2005 or started later, because we have to follow the date. The cutoff date is 2005, December 2005. So on this kind of maps, we could potentially determine the area, when they started it approximately, and whether they are eligible under this law. And this is the positive and the consequence. We all know of property rights and the rule of law and the benefits that property would bring. But this was my first experience of actually seeing it happen on the ground. This is just 2-3 years ago. In fact, 2 years ago, the top picture. End of 2016 and early 2017. Once people started getting their titles, they could approach the banks. And unlike what Rainer said, that the banks can't give you because they don't know where the land is, now there's a document which properly assesses where the land is. And therefore, they can get loans, and farmers, a group of farmers, 5 or 10 of them could come together to buy this kind of solar pumps, or the one on the top, for a 5 to 7 year loan, pay back over a period of time, but the water would give them 2 crops instead of 1, which would be their natural produce, because they are completely dependent on rain, on monsoon. And India typically has 1 crop dependent on monsoon, which can happen in this period of July, August to October. But now, with the irrigation, they can hope to get 2 crops, that is a summer crop and a winter crop. That makes a difference in how much they produce. And then they started forming producer cooperatives. That as the communities came together, they started coming together because they now have confidence that they have a title. And they have an investment going, which means they have to repay that loan, which means they have an interest in ensuring that their crop survives, which means they have more production, which means they have to be able to take it to the market. The long chart that Rainer showed in terms of rice marketing, they tried to overcome that by forming their own companies or cooperatives, whereby they were grading and up. This is lentil. I don't know what's lentil. You understand lentil, yeah. They were drying it and grading it in order to add value to it. Instead of selling it raw, which is a lower price, the price would immediately double if you grade it properly and have it dried. So they have their livelihood impact directly. And this, to me, is amazing because I had followed the story of property rights for 20, 30 years in India. But I could not believe that we will actually see in real life the kind of impact it has here and now. not 10 years later. I won't get into this. This is another, to me, a very good example that you mentioned environment that I'm interested in, the issue of environment. Environmental problems are largely a tragedy of the commons. And here we see how the communities are coming together because now they have rights over parts of the forest around them. They're trying to replant in this particular area with bamboo so that they can sell the bamboo and regrow it. And they're designing the plan in such a manner that a bamboo is a crop that grows in 5 to 6 years, which means they have to rotate their land. So all that is happening by people who till 2, 3, 4 years ago had no idea that this could happen. But to me, this is the most interesting one. We had half of India till a couple of years ago. Half of Indian houses, particularly in rural India, 80% of them didn't have toilet attached to it or anywhere near it. And we were all shocked, including my friends who have been working with these villagers for 30 years. They were shocked that one of the first demands that came from these people were, now that we have title over the land and therefore the house, let's invest and build our own toilets. I saw them bake their own bricks, as you see there, lay it out, design it to the extent that they think they can afford and want. So some of them would just have the pit. Others would have a bathroom, a water tank, as well as a toilet, depending on who has the capacity to build as much. We were shocked because for 40 years we are being told that the poor are ignorant, illiterate, they don't value sanitation. They are completely unaware of the value of hygiene. This was I can't believe how shocked we were when we realized that the villagers were asking that let's build toilet as one of their first priorities. That's what I said, it's not money that's the problem. They didn't lack money, they spent their own money to build these. And I think that's why to me this is an example which is live, which is happening in front of our own eyes, and this can unleash enormous change in much of the developing countries, because one common feature of all developing countries, and to a large extent even in China today, that a substantial population depends on agriculture and lives in rural areas and in poverty. So I think my time's up, long up perhaps. Let me just recap with a final history, because this I thought I was telling Razin at break. Property historically has been a key driver of political change. From ancient Greece to Magna Carta, to the US Revolution, to the adult franchise in England, even to Chinese Revolution. We were discussing in China last month that Mao's Long March was a retreat. That retreat in the 30s turned into a victory in 1949, primarily because he offered land to the tiller. Yeah, without the land to the tiller, the farmers would not have backed the army that wanted to fight. And as Napoleon said, armies cannot fight on an empty stomach. And the Indian Constitution. Indian Constitution was one of the first constitutions, in fact, perhaps the first constitution, which recognized right to property as a fundamental right in 1950. But over the next 30 years, we diluted and ultimately deleted it. Still, the lesson is, it doesn't matter what the letter of the law is. Once the people begin to realize the value of the idea, they'll seize and shape the law as they want it. And in India, we see exactly that's happening. The right to property had been deleted legally from the Constitution. But over the last 25, 30 years, it's the same people who've increasingly demanded that their land rights be protected, and we are trying to turn the clock back. Thank you very much.